Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again for another live edition of Everything Compliance. Today we have the quartet of Karen Woody, Jonathan Marks, Karen Moore, and Matt Kelly. We are going to shake things up geographically today. We usually go east to west, but we're going to go south to north today. Once again, showing us who really won the Civil War. We're going to start with Karen Woody, then we're going to go to Karen Moore, then we're going to Jonathan Marks, and we're going to let Matt Kelly back clean up today. We're going to have our great shout outs and rants at the end. So Karen Woody, your expertise is generally thought to be around the Securities and Exchange Commission, and we're going to have as large a change in the new administration in that arena. I think you may actually know Paul Atkins, but if you don't, you know of him. What do you see at this point for the SEC?
Yeah, it's a great question. I know it was the thing we talked about on our last podcast, was trying to predict who would be next. And now we know it's Paul Atkins, who's a former commissioner of the SEC. I should disclose that I do know Paul. This is some of the, I don't know if we call it benefits, but just the fact of the matter is I am born and raised in Washington, D.C., and Paul Atkins lives down the road from my folks. So I've known him for quite some time. He's a good guy. I will say I think his policies are going to be very different from what we've seen under the Gensler administration. He is not going to be very, we're not going to see this robust enforcement division the way we saw with Gensler. He's not a Mary Jo White. We're going to see, I think, a pullback from, the sort of strident, I think, enforcement division that we've seen under Gensler, and the sort of ambitious SEC rulemaking and sort of stretches to some extent maybe of the authority of the SEC. I think he's someone who's much more in the let's retrench a little bit from what we've seen before. But I will say, given that, and I think there's some people who are dismayed by that, and I would be among them, I think there were some great plans and protocols and things that I think the SEC was doing under Gensler that is mostly, I think, going to be entirely scrapped, a number of those things. But if there's some silver lining to this, it is that, he is, one, kind of a known quantity, and he's someone who's been at the SEC and I think has some respect for the institution, given his background there. I just say this as compared to some of the other Trump picks who were just wildly unqualified, or just nowhere close to maybe the expertise we'd expect for certain agencies or things that they've been tapped to run. Paul Atkins knows the SEC. He knows securities law. I don't think this is someone who is completely out of left field. I think, sure, he's going to have a much further right tack than anyone that we would have seen under any other administration, but it's not going to feel as sort of incompetent as maybe some other areas of the federal government might seem. So that's my take. I mean, it's yet to be seen how that plays against the Elon, deregulatory mandate that he seems to have. And for that reason, I think, appreciate the gravitas that Paul Atkins will bring to this, that he can push back against hopefully what might be someone who is trying to get rid of the agency altogether. So, I mean, we'll see what happens. I think, if nothing else, I guess I should say, when Paul left the SEC last time, he started his consulting firm, and a number of his clients are in the crypto space. And I would have imagined that I had to imagine that was a prerequisite for the job, that someone would be very friendly toward crypto. I have to imagine that's one of the first questions anyone who was vetting him would have thought. So I think we'll see exactly what we expected in that space. Someone who's very friendly toward crypto, very, much that they will have a light touch on over regulation, or maybe even any level of regulation in the crypto space. But we'll see.
Karen, Matt and I had the chance to visit on this on our most recent Compliance Into the Weeds. And one of the things that we talked about was a paper that Atkins had written in the first decade of this year, where he laid out many of his thoughts and philosophies. And one of the things we talked about was individual prosecutions, or prosecution of employees, as opposed to corporations, particularly in the area of accounting fraud. And then we transitioned to the FCPA and tried to think about was an FCPA fine, a penalty to the shareholders they had already paid because of something like accounting fraud. Any thoughts on whether we might see an uptick in individual prosecutions?
I mean, I think, yeah, that certainly was the takeaway. This is his paper with Bondi as well, with Brad Bondi. Is that right? I think
Right.
there's definitely a few writings he's done in the past. And I think I say that I'd be surprised to see an uptick really in any level of extreme prosecution. Uh, I think I sort of read that paper as like we can go after individuals in lieu of the corporation. Whether or not we actually see robust prosecution of individuals as the outcome of that, if nothing else, it's sort of the means to the end, which is less prosecution of corporations. And I think that argument that this is, another hit against the shareholders of the company is one that, I think Atkins, Brad Bondi, one of his, sort of acolytes who worked for him, who had been floated as maybe one of the potential candidates here. Same with Hester Peirce. I should note that Bondi, Hester Peirce, and a number of others were counsel to Atkins when he was at the SEC before. So it's sort of the same type of thinking on this. And so it's not uncommon to have that argument. Like, let's not hit the company too hard because the shareholders have already taken a hit. And that's really who this runs down to. I think there'd be a number of people who would forcefully push back against that idea and think that there should be some real accountability on the corporate level. And so whether or not the shift is then we go after individuals more, I'm not sure if we'll actually see that.
Matt, do you have a question and or comment for Karen?
Well, probably a comment, although Karen, if you have any thoughts, I'd be eager to hear them afterwards, is that I think the biggest thing that strikes me about Atkins is that he last was at the agency in 2008. So I suppose my big question is, how does he take his 2000s era views about capital markets and corporate enforcement and regulatory policy, and how does he fit them into a 2020s world? And I think the corporate penalties is a great example. When he, in 2005, I came across a speech he gave where he said, clearly financial fraud hurts the shareholders already. So why would we impose a penalty and hurt them even more? And I get that for financial fraud, but in 2005, financial fraud was the thing. And now it's not. I mean, we still have accounting fraud and enforcement actions, but the FCPA is the dominant concern. And in FCPA enforcement, shareholders don't actually suffer from an FCPA enforcement action. It's not like a CFO screws over the shareholders and takes away some money they thought they had. FCPA enforcement is very different, and FCPA enforcement wasn't a thing, really, when Atkins was last at the SEC. Another example, I'll give two that come to my mind. How would he deal with cybersecurity disclosures or faulty disclosures? That, again, he left in 2008. The SEC didn't even adopt any cybersecurity guidance until 2011, and now it's a big deal. Or how is he going to handle whistleblower complaints, which can be a wonderful tool for corporate enforcement, but the Office of the Whistleblower didn't even exist when he was last at the SEC. So there's a lot of stuff like that I just wonder, how is he going to sort of modernize his views? And I get it that, I agree that A, he is going to care about the agency, which is more than you can say for a lot of other Trump people. But B, he's going to be a really right-wing interpretation of these views. But there's still a lot of stuff he's going to have to deal with that I don't know that he ever had spoken out about it before. And that's where I'm going to be very curious to see what he does.
No, I agree. And especially in an agency like the SEC, where he's now at the helm, that's different than sort of railing against, this extension that Gensler's done. Now you're in charge and you probably do want to protect that agency and do some good there. But I don't think it'll be dismantling it in a way that, so in the sense of how right wing can we get, I don't think he's going to go that far, but how that then works in sort of these smaller, or not even smaller, but in the intricacies of the issues he'll be faced with, I'm not sure. We just know that the answer is going to be whatever makes it easier for the corporation, I think. And so, and like I said, I don't think that's going to mean, then we go after CEOs. I don't think he's going to do that either.
Yeah.
Karen, what do you think it might mean for the PCAOB?
Well, that I think is a really big. That's one I'm sort of figuring Matt would also bring up. I don't know is the answer. I think we're going to see some changes there, maybe, but both the PCAOB and to some extent FINRA, the level of authority that these self-regulatory organizations have. I think that might, like I said, someone who has been at the agency before, had been at the agency in the 2000s, as you said, I have to imagine they appreciate the maybe even efficiencies that those institutions bring and wouldn't want to just sort of toss it out of hand. But I don't know. And I don't know how his thinking has evolved as it's moved further right, maybe in this Trump world. But so I think that is one we're going to have to watch closely.
All right. Well, let's move a little bit north to Karen Moore. And Karen, you and I and we on this podcast have talked about sustainability, ESG topics many times. There's now a clear anti-ESG movement, and there may even be anti-ESG legislation, but that's not the same across the globe. So I really wanted to get your thoughts on, one, what does the rest of the world, particularly EU, have to say on this? And then two, what are U.S. companies going to do, U.S. internationally facing companies going to do with this internal backlash in the United States, yet across the globe have significant requirements to meet?
The EU has become this leading guide for how multinationals or companies dealing with the EU commercially need to act, and it's starting with GDPR. We're seeing a really big push for extraterritorial effect of what might be broadly defined as human rights driven legislation, and the CSRD I think is a big part of it. It's one part of the Green Deal that the EU has implemented alongside the CSDDD, triple D. So we've got the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, kind of talking about reporting requirements for material sustainability impacts, and the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, kind of like a human rights and environmental due diligence responsibility. So we've got transparency on the one side, responsibility on the other. The other two parts of the Green Deal are a taxonomy regulation and then also a finance disclosure regulation, the SFDR. I mean, we're going to end up drowning in letters in the next few minutes, but the SFDR is really kind of an anti-greenwashing push to make sure that there is an appropriate assessment and transparency in reporting of financial products. So we've kind of got this package in the EU, but as I'm going to mention, has a extraterritorial impact. So even if the U.S. isn't jumping on the bandwagon as fast as it might, I think that there's some inevitability that it's going to be influential, and we're going to see kind of the way we've seen the development in the U.S. of privacy laws going state by state. And I keep praying and wishing for a federal level data privacy law to kind of bring them all together. I think we're going to be waiting on that for a while, but we're starting to see movements, and instead of the U.S. being the driver, I'm starting to see the EU a little bit more as the center of that. So just talking about the CSRD, you can't do it without talking about the CSDDD as well. But the CSRD right now applies to a pretty narrow band of companies in the EU. But if you've got securities listed or traded in the EU, and that's a lot of US multinationals, then you're subject to it. And then any large companies in the EU with at least two of the requirements based on employee numbers, that's greater than 250, so that's pretty low, greater than 50 million euros in net turnover or 25 million balance sheet total. So then you're subject to it whether or not you're trading securities. And then there is this kind of extraterritorial provision there if you're a non-EU parent, but you've got an EU subsidiary or a branch with 150 million in turnover, then you've got to comply with the CSRD, and effectively you've got to report on your sustainability standards for environmental, human rights, and governance. The CSDDD, on the other hand, has got kind of in some ways, a higher bar to meet for applications. I know I talked about this in the past, but I think it's important to talk about them both together because you have to piecemeal them together. You've got EU companies with more than 1,000 employees. That was a lot of horse trading to get it there, and greater than 450 million in worldwide net turnover. Non-EU companies, same thing, greater than 450 million euros in the EU. And with the CSDDD, you've got these really high due diligence requirements and obligations to identify human rights, environmental impacts within your own operations, but also throughout your supply chain. It's a pretty big burden. Interestingly, last month, the EU Commission started talking about maybe trying to merge these two regulations, which would be really nice because right now you're bouncing back and forth between the two. So we'll see. They may try to consolidate at least these two, if not the SFDR, the financial reporting requirements. Now, what is really interesting before we go into whether U.S. companies should care about this is that you have to remember in the EU, when you've got a directive, it doesn't enter into force as the directive. The directive directs all of the member states to transpose the requirements of the regulation into national law. And with the CSRD, there was a July 2024 deadline for transposition. And the European Commission recently sent out 17, so a pretty large number, 17 notifications of infringement to member states because they still have not completed transposition, even though the law is supposed to start January 1 of 2025 with the first set of reporting requirements, publication requirements for companies that need to respond to the CSRD. So it kind of remains to be seen how that's going to happen. The first reports are due, but I don't know, in 17 countries, does that mean you wait or you just report based on the kind of the direction that is in the directive rather than the mandatory requirement contained in national law? It's not really clear. So you've got this double materiality standard for reporting. So whether or not the transposition happens or is applicable to your operations right now, it's really good to start looking at that. You have to look at both the financial impact, but also the environmental and societal impact of your operations. Another just really interesting thing before I get to why U.S. companies should care about this is the transposition has base requirements, but there is room for the national law, and I think Germany believe in this because they had a piece of I know you are not laughing at me, Tom, but the national requirements can be difficult and impose higher and tougher standards, like extending the scope of companies. So it's really important to keep an eye on the national laws that you may be subject to. So we've got CSRD, we have CSDDD. I think it's going to be interesting to see, how that starts to influence. But in the meantime, U.S. companies do need to care about this, regardless of what's happening here in the U.S., and there's quite a lot. First of all, the U.S. company may meet the scoping requirements of CSRD, and so you are, whether or not you want to be, you are subject to its requirements, including the publication of your reports at some point, depending on transposition, I guess. Also, the CSDDD, because there is such a broad supply chain requirement, even if you have no direct EU operations, you may be the supplier of an EU company, which is going to be caught in the due diligence requirements. So you do need to take a look at some of that. Other than that, we've got to start taking a look at what's going on. And Karen, you didn't really talk about the federal mandate on ESG reporting that the SEC has been trying to implement and where that's going to go. But right now, there's no federal mandate of ESG reporting other than this kind of attempt by the SEC to require disclosure of ESG information that may be material to investors, whether it's climate-related disclosures, enhancement or standardization of climate-related disclosures for investments rule. There's some kind of movement there. There's some state requirements as well, but we've started to see delays there, and I imagine we're going to see even more delays and pushback. California, not surprisingly, has been leading the charge here, but they've got delay on 2 different climate corporate actions. So we don't know when California is actually going to step up there. SASB, I think, has been a really influential but not mandatory set of standards. That's a Sustainability Accounting Standards Board that's put in requirements that a lot of multinationals are using as a benchmark. And then we've seen, but it's now 2 years and it hasn't really passed yet, some FAR amendments on federal supplier climate risk and resilience reporting. So that's a rule that was proposed in 2022, but still hasn't passed and may never pass. I guess bottom line here is if you're dealing in the EU, make sure you understand what your obligations are, but maybe use the EU directives directionally to see where things may head in the future. I think like so many of these kind of ESG related, DEI, environmental related areas for corporate operations, it's my soapbox. You've got to get back to your core values and see what's important to you, what's important to your stakeholders. Some of the CSRD opportunities in the transposition may require employee consultations here. We are also seeing activist shareholders. The ISS published a 10-year retrospective of shareholder proposals and found that ESG topics in 2024 comprised 62% of the shareholder proposals, with anti-ESG proposals at about 11% in 2024. So these are issues that companies need to do a little bit of navel gazing, I think, to decide what's important to them, be advised directionally while they're also waiting for other regulations. So I think regulation is inevitable. It just may be really slow here in the US.
Karen, one thing I didn't ask you to look at or consider, but I will now, is the business response around sustainability. I see many contracts which require some level of reporting. You mentioned the CSDDD and potential down the chain suppliers that may supply something that goes up to an EU company. I saw this in compliance, or at least anti-corruption compliance, where there was as much business-driven requirements for compliance in contracts. Are you seeing that in contracts, commercial contracts as well, in addition to potentially sources of capital, whether it be a stock market, whether it be bank, whether it be a private equity, whether it be an individual investor, or even such regulated industries and insurance may require that type of reporting?
Yeah, I think that, could be a little bit flavor of the month, but I think also starts to become really important for tracking and meeting due diligence requirements across the board, to shove requirements into contracts. I think like with anti-bribery provisions that were also became really popular and mandated, or this sort of you must comply with our supplier code of conduct language. The rubber meets the road in whether A, you have audit provisions there, and more importantly, B, whether you're actually enforcing those audit provisions and going out and seeing whether your suppliers are doing what they're doing. I mean, I get that it can be kind of tough and a big burden. I call the CSDDD the blueberry problem, because it comes to the point where if you've got, blueberry muffins that you're buying for your canteen, you need to know where the blueberries were grown and how those blueberries are being grown. But yeah, I think contract provisions they're a good control mechanism or risk mitigation mechanism, but they're only as good as the enforcement of where things are going. So
I guess it depends on whether they were Virginia blueberries. Um, all right, Jonathan Marks, you think about fraud a lot, and you think about it retrospectively, and now you're thinking about it down the road. What are you seeing around AI, deep fakes, or other new technological advancements of fraudsters and maybe even fraud fighters?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I happened to catch the episode. I watched the FBI TV series, and I think FBI International, the show this week, had a scene in there where they actually used a deep fake to throw the bureau and some of the other law enforcement agencies off. And I think that, coupled with the U.S. Department of Treasury's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, or as we call it, FinCEN's recent alert, sort of incited me to bring up this topic with you today and, remind you of that. So, for those of you that are listening today, just, I didn't know anything about this up until, maybe probably 2 years ago when this first started happening. But, fraudsters are interesting folks, and, deep fakes are really, it's synthetic media created using advanced generative AI technologies. And we all know that those keep getting better and better. And they generally include hyper realistic videos, audio clips, or images that can really impersonate individuals with uncanny accuracy, I might add, because I was watching this show, and if this truly was a deep fake, it was pretty good because it fooled them as well. And this technology was initially developed for creative and entertainment purposes, and has now been co-opted by bad actors for fraudulent schemes, and not surprisingly. So, imagine receiving a video call from what appears to be your company's CEO, instructing you to wire funds immediately for a confidential project, or consider a scenario where a deep fake generated identification of documents passed through your email, or your rigorous know your customer process. These are really no longer hypothetical, based on what I'm hearing. They're really happening today. So it's really kind of interesting. So fraudsters are leveraging this deepfake technology and social engineering attacks all over the place. And in some cases, they've used AI generated voice technology to impersonate executives, successfully duping employees into transferring, like I said, large sums of monies. These incidents are an evolution of traditional business email compromise schemes, and made more convincing, and they're difficult to really detect, through the use of artificial intelligence. So I guess accordingly, FinCEN's alert to financial institutions is a good one, and they're telling them that they need to be aware of the typologies of deepfake fraud and red flags that may signal this suspicious activity. For example, and these are just some examples, inconsistency in video calls, like unnatural blinking, poor lip syncing, or unusual voice modifications, can indicate manipulated media. But sometimes, again, that's very difficult to discern unless you're absolutely trained in this stuff. But relying on human observation alone at this point, like I said, might really be insufficient in order to really detect this stuff. And so that's where advanced fraud detection tools, I think, are being developed, and they are powered by artificial intelligence, and they are going to play a critical a role in all of this. So, AI to fight AI, so to speak. So, what can we do to combat, these emerging threats? I've been thinking about this. Again, this is, sort of just thumbnail type stuff, but financial institutions and others really must enhance their overall fraud detection capabilities. This includes possibly investing in machine learning tools specifically designed to detect deepfake media. These tools would potentially be able to analyze inconsistencies in media files, which may be, imperceivable to the human eye, or in that fact, our ears, when it comes to listening to certain voices or things like that. Second, and I know we've been getting pounded in the head with this for a long period of time, multi-factor authentication really must become the standard. I know people think it's an absolute pain, but I think it's something I feel more comfortable with when I am using a service, or using a financial institution for certain things. So biometric checks such as fingerprint or facial recognition certainly, should be paired with traditional, methods like password or PINs, which we're all pretty much used to. This obviously adds an additional layer of security that's much harder for fraudsters to bypass. Doesn't mean that they can't, just means it makes it much harder. And then I think the third piece here, which is something that is probably near and dear to all of us, we really must focus on education and awareness. If you're not aware of it, it's going to pass you right by. So employees, particularly those in finance and compliance roles, should really be trained to recognize the red flags associated with deepfake fraud. And this is ever evolving, so it's going to be interesting. Thus training really should include some of the scenarios that I mentioned where employees are encouraged to verify unusual requests, even if they appear to come from trusted sources. So, these are just some things. And then individuals too can take steps to protect themselves, which we all want to do. So if you receive an unexpected video call or an audio message requesting money or sensitive information, take a moment to really verify its authenticity. I just recently was doing a transaction and I got some text messages and emails, and I'm like, well, even though they were legitimate, I was very, very skeptical, and I did everything I could to verify that these were legitimate and coming from a legitimate source. So again, those sources of truth are really something that we should really be looking out for. But, from a practical perspective, looking for inconsistencies, does the speaker's voice sound sort of robotic like, even though that keeps getting better as well? Do their facial movements appear to be unnatural? These could all be signs of a deep fake. But beyond these individual methods, the fight against deep fake fraud requires really true collaboration. The financial institutions and other organizations and technology companies and regulators really need to start working together to develop industry standards and share that particular intelligence. Public awareness campaigns are also vital. Again, getting this out to let people know that these things are happening and they need to be on the lookout for them. The more people understand what deepfakes are and how they're used, I think the harder it will be for fraudsters to exploit this technology. It doesn't mean it's going to be impossible, but it just makes it harder. And so that's why I go back to the alert that FinCEN sent out, and obviously the show that I saw, that it is an important step in raising awareness about this issue and provides some actionable guidance for financial institutions. But I wouldn't just limit it to financial institutions. I think this is something where every organization should actually read and take, some of the things that are in there, seriously. So for those interested, I recommend reviewing that alert, and exploring the tools available for detecting and, manipulated media, so to speak, such as deepfake detection resources developed by AI researchers. And I started doing my own research. There's a bunch of them that are out there. But deepfake fraud represents a rapidly evolving threat in the world that we're living in. These proactive measures, we may be able to mitigate the risks and stay one step ahead of these bad actors, but by leveraging technology, again, AI fighting AI, and fostering collaboration and staying informed, I think we can build a more resilient defense against these types of schemes. And so, I hope that those that are listening again today, if anything, are now more alert and aware that these things are actually out there. They exist, and maybe they'll do their own research and come up with their own conclusions. But it's something that's here. It's something I think it's going to get better and better and better. And if we don't stay ahead of it, it could prove to be problematic for many.
Matt Kelly, you have a question or comment for Mr. Marks?
I did have a comment because I also read that FinCEN alert a week or two ago, and I wrote about it. I mean, I don't want to say I like deepfakes, but I appreciate how much they have underlined a few problems that compliance and audit and risk professionals really need to think about. Yes, to a certain extent, financial firms in particular, and probably all companies need to, they have some regulatory duty to try and think about anti-fraud measures. But even if regulators, for whatever reason, decided to deregulate their attention or de-emphasize their attention to deepfake frauds, like the hackers don't care whether their techniques and attacks are regulated concerns of yours or not. They're still going to do it. So number one, I like that deepfakes remind us there are some things out there that are both compliance and regulatory risks and operational risks. And your company is going to have to address those things somehow. With deepfakes in particular, I get your point, Jonathan, that AI could help to try and counteract other AI, but I actually believe ultimately we're going to have to adopt many more human-based anti-fraud procedures, like literally challenge words. If you get a voicemail from the CEO saying, wire this $10 million right away, well, did the CEO include the challenge word of the day? Or can you ask the CEO, what was that book that we read at book club together last month? And if they don't know, you don't do it. That sort of thing is ultimately going to have to pass and, come to take root. But, I just also keep thinking this is another reminder of how compliance, anti-fraud, and legal teams are all going to have to work together to figure out, regardless of what regulation tells us we should do to fight these risks, these things, we just have to fight them. And it's going to be really hard. How do we get our people to do it and bring the right people together to try and figure it all out? Because this is here to stay, and it's going to be a challenge permanently. It's a chronic condition of compliance and anti-fraud measures from here forward.
No, and I agree with everything that you said, Matt. It's kind of interesting. I did read what you wrote. I thought it was great. I also think that, to your point, those little human elements in there with regards to almost like, we talk about, raising awareness and these rapid evolving threats and having dual factor authentication and things like that. Those little quips and things that you can actually put in messages to indicate whether something is real, that tradecraft is something that's been around for a long time. It's not anything new, but it has to be reinvigorated. Mm-hmm. I was having a conversation earlier in the week about fax machines, going back to fax machines again because of email and email compromise. And I recall it was probably 6 or 7 years ago. I got a phone call from an attorney who was irate because the CFO of one of their clients wired $24 million overseas because he got an email from one of the board members saying, "Hey, we're doing this deal. Please wire to $24 million." And we were able to walk that back, which was interesting at the time. But these things have been around for a while. The AI stuff is interesting. But I think you're absolutely right. Is that those things, those Tony Soprano methods are going to have to be implemented going forward in order to really combat this. And again, it is tradecraft, and it is something that we need to be cognizant of. And if you're going to combat this, the best way to do that, I think, to your point, is going outside those systems, going back to, hey, what book, what book did we talk about last week at lunch? Or, is your favorite color still purple, or things like that? I think all those things are really fair game, and they're really great points.
All right. Matt, you have been writing and thinking about a lot of issues on the upcoming administration, from DOJ to the Department of Justice and everything in between. What are you thinking about today?
Tom, is it French? Is it Doge or is it Doge?
I think you call it Doge. But that is a good point, because the whole thing is named after one of those cryptocurrencies called, it's spelled DOGE. I don't actually know how it's pronounced, because if you're that obsessed over crypto, you're missing the point of life. But I'm going to call it Doge, the Department of Government Efficiency, which I have been struck by how many compliance officers are really interested in what Doge is trying to do. So I'm going to take this in three parts. What does Doge claim it's going to do? What is Doge actually trying to do, which in my opinion is not the same? And then if this comes to pass, what are some of the implications for compliance and risk professionals? Because I think there are going to be a lot. So this is, of course, that committee that is established by Donald Trump, who basically just handed it over to Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. For those who are not familiar with Ramaswamy, he is a failed biotech entrepreneur who has had fraud allegations swirling around him for several years. But he ran against Donald Trump in the Republican primaries, then backed out, endorsed him, kissed his rear end, and now he's co-chair of Doge. But their mission, allegedly, is to cut the federal workforce and cut federal expenditures by $2 trillion. And they're going to do this. They actually, Musk and Ramaswamy, published an article in the Wall Street Journal outlining their plan. It had 4 parts. Number one, they are going to hire a lean team of small government crusaders. Now, first off, who are these crusaders? We don't know. Who is paying them? We don't know. What meetings is this team having, and are minutes being taken? Is it open to the public? Apparently not, because they've already been meeting. I haven't seen any open meeting notices, but they have this team of crusaders who are going to go through federal agencies, decide which regulations exist that exceed the boundaries of what the statute allows that agency to do. And then they're going to come up with a plan of government regulations that should be eliminated. Then Musk and Ramaswamy said, for every regulation that is eliminated, there is going to be at least a proportionate to the number of federal employees to be cut should be at least proportionate to the number of federal regulations that are nullified, close quote. So to eliminate half of all federal regulations, according to Musk and Ramaswamy, you will therefore be able to eliminate half of all government employees. I'll get into why that is nonsense in a moment. But then they'll have all of these regulations that are supposedly on the chopping block. They'll give that to Trump, who will then say, I am no longer going to enforce these regulations. And then he will start the process of rescission to eliminate all of these rules. After that, once the rules are gone, they're going to use various legal maneuvers, thanks to the Supreme Court and its anti-regulation rulings from earlier this year, to prevent the regulators in the future from ever being able to reintroduce those rules. That's the whole big plan. Here's why it won't work in practice. Number one, if you cut half of all federal employees, you cannot do that without cutting into uniformed military personnel and Veterans Affairs people, who are the solid majority of actual federal government employees. There are 2.3 million people working for the federal payroll, including all the soldiers, all the VA people, everybody else, Congress, government lawyers, White House staff, air traffic controllers, drug inspectors, Border Patrol agents, everybody. You cut that number in half down to 1.15 million. Well, 1.3 million of the 2.3 million in total are uniformed soldiers. So you could get rid of every single other person and still not be at your half reduction. You'd have to cut into soldiers. And we're just not going to do that. And everybody knows this. This is a charade to think that it's really about cutting government employees. And in fact, Vivek Ramaswamy even went on TV not long ago to say, well, actually, we're not that interested in the headcount. We're really interested in just constraining what government can do. So I want to call that out, that when they say it's Department of Government efficiency, it's not about letting people on the payroll do what they do more efficiently. It's about the government doing fewer things. Okay, if that's what you want, and there are a lot of libertarians out there who would say, sign me up, that's great, that's what I voted for, and Trump won. But again, you can't get that $2 trillion savings that we mentioned before. That's the number. You can't do that without cutting into defense spending, Social Security, Medicare, payment on the interest of the federal debt. Those four things alone occupy about 64% of all federal spending. So you could get rid of every other dime we spend. No SEC, no Border Patrol, no drug research, no diplomatic missions, nobody renewing your passport, none of it. There's no people, and we're not spending a dime. You still haven't achieved that $2 trillion in savings because Social Security, Medicare, defense, VA, counseling, and interest on the national debt. Right there. The whole premise of this doesn't work mathematically, can't work. What they're really about is just these libertarian small government crusaders, again, whoever they are, whoever's paying them, we don't know. They're just getting together and deciding what agencies do we not like. And therefore, we're going to propose eliminating them. And you're starting to see some of that now in the press. Just today, there's an article in the Wall Street Journal that they want to eliminate or streamline a lot of the banking agencies. Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, they say, get rid of it. They would have deposit insurance run by the Treasury Department. Never mind that the FTC is really just a glorified insurance company. that inspects its customers, who are banks, to make sure they don't wind up reporting a loss and needing a claim. And the Treasury Department is not an insurance company, and it won't really know what to do with the FDIC. Elon Musk has proposed getting rid of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. By coincidence, he announced his desire to see the CFPB go away one day after the CFPB gave itself regulatory authority to oversee fintechs that engage in financial transactions and large tech companies and tech platforms that allow for fintech payments, much like Twitter, which happens to be owned by Elon Musk. So a lot of what you're going to see with agencies, we're going to deregulate this one, we're going to eliminate that one. The through line for a lot of it is just what regulators are irritating Elon Musk and his friends. He wants to get rid of the National Labor Relations Board and a lot of its rules. Tesla is under investigation by the NLRB. They clearly want to allow for crypto. Again, frankly, I think if you're obsessed over crypto, you're missing the point of life. But, okay, well, actually, who owns a lot of crypto? Elon Musk. Who runs a crypto business? Donald Trump. It's a lot of that. So I do question, when this plan comes about, how much is it actually really going to happen? You can't get rid of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau without statutory permission from Congress. It would take a change in federal law. You couldn't get rid of the FDIC without a new legislation from Congress. Ditto the Public Accounting Oversight Board. A lot of it maybe you could do. I'm open to the idea that the PCAOB becomes a division of audit oversight within the SEC. That might be dumb. I'm not sure, but it could work. But you can't just do it by tweet. You would actually have to enact new legislation. So again, show me how that gets passed when the Republicans have a 1-seat majority in the House, and they do still have a filibuster in the Senate. The Democrats aren't going to go along with this. A lot of this isn't going to happen. I would just counsel compliance and risk people, though, to think about those things that do happen when they wish away or tweet away some of these regulatory constraints, the agencies, whatever. The risk itself is still going to be there. It might transform. It might get more complicated. An example of what I mean is Republicans have talked about getting rid of CISA. That is the Critical Infrastructure Security Agency. It's the closest thing we have to a cybersecurity regulator in the United States. CISA doesn't actually adopt rules. It can't enforce penalties, but it comes up with standards you're supposed to obey. And if you get rid of CISA, what would then happen? Well, I think you would see, and others have said this, including some Republicans, that we could just devolve CISA's authority and duties to the states. So you're telling me that we already complain about how we don't have a federal privacy law. Companies are driven bonkers by the 50 different state privacy laws we have. Now we're going to do the same for cybersecurity standards, which, by the way, are clearly a far more pressing thing. I don't like having my data privacy stolen by hackers, but it's happened to me a dozen times. I do really fear that we could have major ransomware attacks that you can't pump gas, you can't get money out of the bank, you can't schedule your hospital appointments, all of which have happened within the last several years. And now we're going to have a state level patchwork of it. So, and again, you see that this is a mess. This is going to be chaotic. But fundamentally, even if we achieve some of what DOGE wants, that's going to create a far more risky environment for businesses who do not want a lot of freedom. They want a lot of certainty. And if they're certain that they could do this sort of a thing to make money, then they'll do that sort of a thing. They want to complain about a tight regulatory compliance structure, but I think they would rather have that than they would rather have nothing at all. And there's just this whirlwind of risks, and you don't have a good answer, and you're going to get sued or in the bad press all the time. So there's a lot to think about there, but ultimately, I don't know that there's much there. And I don't know that this would then result in mass unemployment for compliance officers because we have no more regulatory compliance. We are still going to have a lot of regulatory compliance needs and a lot of risk management needs. And compliance and risk management are melding together. So I still think that, this is overspending in the government is a problem. Overregulation is a problem. But what Doge is saying, that is not a solution for the problem we actually have. It's a solution for a different problem a very few number of very wealthy people have.
All right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we are to fan favorites, shout outs, and rants. Why don't we keep the same order, and I will slide in batting fifth today. So, Professor Woody, do you have a shout out and or rant for us today?
I have a bit of a rant today, and I haven't thought too much about it other than just to have a knee-jerk reaction rant, and that is to yesterday's announcement that Times Person of the Year is Donald Trump for the second time. I wonder if this magazine is in the tank for this guy, because of all the people in the course of the universe of this planet this year who has made headlines, I get that he has, but the idea of acknowledging him as the person of the year is, I think, just absurd. And, I know there's been a lot of pushback, and Times sort of said, no, this is, it's always sometimes provocative, but it is something that I think makes it even more of a joke. So maybe they think that sells more magazines. I'm not sure, but I think it's crazy. That's my rant.
Karen Moore.
Yeah, I'm going to just give a shout out at this time of year to all the delivery guys out there for Amazon and FedEx and DHL. And yes, the U.S. Postal Service. I mean, they are just doing a phenomenal job, in rain and sun and cold. And, just really appreciate them. We were trying to make a concerted effort to consolidate some of our online shopping, but I feel like somebody's here at my door pretty much every day. And when I do catch them, they're usually, kind of ready to smile and say, have a great day. So I just shout out to them for doing a great job for what I know is pretty minimal pay.
Jonathan Marks.
Yeah, I'm going to give a shout out to Miriam Chamani, an 81-year-old voodoo priestess in New Orleans who is trying to revive that particular religion, which is kind of interesting, but more for the fact that she's trying to really continue with something that she believes in, as really this symbol of resilience and cultural preservation, at least in her mind. And for those of you that don't know anything about voodoo, voodoo centers on the worship of a single supreme creator, often called the Bandi, and a pantheon of intermediary spirits known as Iwa or Urshis. So it's kind of interesting. I knew nothing about it, but I did not know that there was a single supreme creator called the Bandi. So that's kind of interesting to me. So that's my shout out.
Wow. Working on a lot of levels there, Mr. Marks. Matt Kelly.
Well,
just for Professor Woody.
I realized that my Doge speech probably sounded like a 8-minute rant, and unfortunately, I have another one. I have a shout out and a rant. I am going to first start with a shout out to the people of South Korea for standing up to that power grab their President Yoon tried to enact and then thankfully failed with, where he declared that he was going to implement martial law in the middle of the night. Everybody showed up at the Congress or the Parliament building in South Korea to basically say no. I loved the image of the protesters there who were helping to lift South Korean lawmakers up over the fence to get into their congressional chambers so they could vote against that declaration of martial law. And it is just refreshing to see that there are still lawmakers out there who take their duties seriously against overweening executive power, which brings me to the rant. And I really do have to rant about President Trump nominating Pete Hegseth as defense secretary. And here's why. The South Korea thing actually got me thinking about this, that let's just imagine that he had declared martial law in South Korea. North Korea then panicked and launched a preemptive attack against South Korea, which is probably not a far-fetched thing, considering how nutty South Korea is. Well, We, the United States, are treaty bound to be military allies and come to the defense of South Korea. And Russia is now treaty bound to come to the military defense of North Korea. And this could very easily have brought us into direct conflict with Russia when we're already eyeball to eyeball with them in Ukraine. Now, imagine a scenario like that, where really it could get very scary. You'd have the fate of 330 million Americans hanging in the balance, and the man you want to bring to help to resolve that is somebody like Pete Hegseth? Seriously, do we not understand just how dangerous this world is sometimes? And Trump has put forward somebody who is an alcoholic, apparently a sexual predator. The very few private enterprises he's ever tried to run are these tiny little charities that he mismanaged so poorly, they would be candidates to be discussion on this podcast itself. And now he's going to be allegedly Secretary of Defense when he has no experience. I get why Donald Trump wanted to nominate Hegseth, because Trump is an old man who's going into senility and he spends most of his day watching TV. And Pete Hegseth is a pretty man who says nice things about him on TV. And that really is one of Trump's big criteria for who he wants around him. Will they do what I say? Will they defend me well on TV? And that's it. And I suppose my rant ultimately is just for the Republicans in Congress to stand up and say, this is serious stuff. And we cannot have these kooks like Pete Hegseth trying to run the country, because he can't do it. The lawmakers in South Korea understood what their duty was. It would be refreshing if the Republicans in the U.S. Senate would also maybe see it and just call me crazy, but maybe do your job instead of just bowing down. It is just nuts. That's all.
Well, for once, I'm going to have a shout out to hopefully something that will put a smile on everyone's face. If you have not heard of the Shuffle Mamas, you need to. They are an internet phenomenon. They popped up on my Facebook Reels feed. The Shuffle Mamas are literally two mamas, a 41-year-old mother and a 39-year-old mother. And the 41 has 3 children. The 39 has 2 and is very pregnant right now. What do? They shuffle. Literally, they do 30 to 60 second shuffles and post them on Facebook, and to all types of songs. They shuffle in their garage with the washing machine going on behind them, with their kids playing, and they completely love shuffling. I didn't know you could shuffle while you're 8 months pregnant, but apparently you can. The Shuffle Mamas are a phenomenon. They were and they're from Kansas City, and they went down to be interviewed on the local radio station. So I'm going to shout out to the Shuffle Mamas. If you're on Facebook, just put in Shuffle Mamas and see what they do. And I think it'll put a smile on your face, even if this entire episode didn't. So with that, I think this is everything compliance for 2024, ladies and gentlemen. I can't wait to see what 2025 brings us all.